Learning curves are a concept that we're all familiar with. We probably first heard the term in elementary school, but it's an element that plays a large role in entrepreneurship, and particularly when you think about competition and what it takes to succeed in your venture. So when we look at opportunity and competition, there are elements of industry condition and industry status that are important to understand. But in the context of recognizing opportunities and how to outcompete competition, learning curves, complementary assets, and reputation effects are three areas that we're going to really examine. These are in the competition element of the opportunity analysis canvas. So when we define a learning curve, fundamentally we're looking at the rate of learning with experience. How long does it take to get good at something? For a simple app, perhaps an Angry Birds app, it's probably hours. You can play for a few hours and get fairly good once you understand the basic principles of the game. There are other things that take a bit longer. To be a championship world-class tennis player, it's about 15 years, which to reach your physical peak of late teens or early 20s, you need to start playing at 5 or 6 years old, if not earlier. It takes a long time to be world-class. In the business context, when we think about learning curves, we want to recognize that it's influenced by what you know today. It's influenced by your interest, your commitment, and your resources for learning new things in the future. So when we look at who does learning curves advantage, well, it's typically the large companies. A large company that's been there and done it and has learned from their mistakes and grown from trial and error and built expertise is certainly going to have an advantage over the new entrant, over the entrepreneur, which hasn't had those past experiences. Now, there's certainly a lot that can be learned from companies in the space and that can be learned from customers in the space, but I would caution you from trying to do the same thing as a large company because they probably have learned how to do it and how to do it well. And when we look at that and try and quantify that, Fortune magazine every year ranks the Fortune 500, the largest revenue generating companies, and they've done it annually since 1955. So we're going to look at 4 different elements with the companies remaining on the list on the left-hand side and the years from start on the bottom. What we see is that if we look at the black line, the 1955 line, and who were the companies of the Fortune 500 in 1955, roughly half of them, if you drop down to the 250 mark, so 250 of those companies, were still on the list 25 years later. So they remained competitive and they remained among the largest 500 companies for 25 years. Now, a second wave of companies we'll take a look at from 1965. Of the 1965 companies in blue, 250 of them, approximately half, were still on the list 22 years later. The third line, 1975, were still on the list, half of them, approximately 16 years later. In 1995, when we look at a more current edition, roughly 12 years passed with half of them still on the list. So we learn a few things here. We recognize that the large companies have still remained very large and very successful for anywhere from 12 to 26 years. But we've also seen a decline of approximately half, meaning that companies are having more success in being different, and the incumbents are having more of a challenge of being competitive. So for us as entrepreneurs, this is a bit of an encouraging sign in that companies that are large are not always going to be large forever, and they're going to be replaced with new industries and new markets and new technologies. But we see that once they have that foothold, they are difficult to topple. We also want to take a look at IPOs as another measure of this. And how long does it take to IPO? How long does it take to grow to the stage where you may be 100 million or a $200 million revenue generating company and attractive in the IPO market. And it's changed a bit. In the late 90s, it was down to 4 or 5 years, medium age for a company to be able to go public. Now, once a lot of that flurry passed, and once a lot of that enthusiasm passed, you see the number of IPOs dramatically decline, and still relatively conservative today versus historic numbers. You also see the median age of companies, as indicated by the dashed line, go up quite a bit. We see peaks of 14 and 15 years in some cases when we look in 2007, 2008. Even more recently, we see an average of around 10 years for these companies, meaning from the time of conception to when they IPO'd, it took 10 years on average to go public. So again, it takes some time to build expertise, even as a high-flying tech company. We also see evolving models of learning, and we will look at it here from a higher education standpoint. You know, what we call traditional on the far left-hand side is largely bundled learning. It's largely an instructor that is giving examinations, that's giving the same lecture to many different students, that there are traditional assessments of exams that are built in, and that's the traditional classroom. Stage 1 by this graphic is online and blended and more innovative, with a traditional financial model that may still be tuition-based. Stage 2 is some level of unbundling, where perhaps it's a more customized curriculum, maybe more courses, maybe shorter length courses, maybe new business models where you're paying by the course and not a flat tuition. Stage 3, Stage 4, Stage 5 continues to gravitate towards the more free-range learning that's transformed into unbundling, that's more value-focused, that's more applied, that's more differentiated business models. But what we see within higher ed is we are largely, in the US and in most other places, in what I would argue is somewhere between traditional and Stage 1. So still very early on. But what you're seeing regarding new companies that are emerging, with Coursera and the MOOCs and other things that are taking shape, they're certainly moving through this path at a much faster rate, partnering with universities to do it, but they're certainly far down the path of probably at a Stage 3 or 4, or even 5 in some cases, where they are innovating much faster. And so by that measure, what we see with learning and adaptation and competence building, if you're doing something new as a startup, it's going to be much more difficult for the incumbent, the large companies, in this case it's the large universities, to catch up with you. We also encourage you to learn from customers. So this is very much in the lean startup methodology, in the business model canvas methodology, where you can take an original idea, test it in the market, learn from prospective customers. Now, sometimes the answer is going to be that they're not interested and there's not a market, and that's okay. In other cases, you're going to get positive feedback that will give you insights on how to evolve, how to pivot, how to enhance, how to have a version 2 of that, and then test that within the market. So as you're climbing that learning curve, we certainly advocate you incorporating customers and learning from customers as key elements of that process. There are also a lot of resources out there. A couple of tips on those resources are provided within the modules that you'll see online in Canvas, where we give you links to a couple of resources and a few tips on how to get moving down this path of understanding competition. There are also abundant University of Maryland resources that as graduate students you have unique access to that are based in our library, some of which we've talked about before, such as IBIS, some others that might be new, like Hoover's and Factiva. So don't limit yourself to only looking at the public domain sources and Googling to learn about companies and markets and competition. Go online and leverage some of these paid resources as well. We've linked to these too within our Canvas module. There's also abundant resources provided by governments, both in the US and beyond, that can give you insights into understanding markets and industries and competition. So we've linked to these as well. So in summary, we want you to do your research and embrace learning to climb that learning curve. We want you to climb it quickly, and also keep in mind that the learning curve is probably to your advantage when you're looking at new industries and looking at new markets. If you're trying to do something new, there are going to be fewer people out there that have more experience than you doing it. We also want you to think about how to minimize the gap between your knowledge and your competitors' knowledge. And that, again, is on this mantra of thinking about new, of thinking about being different, of incorporating customer feedback as you're doing it, and working to climb that learning curve quickly.